Welcome to the night. They never wrote about 1970. Deep in the Cambodian jungle near Angkor Wat, where a U.S. patrol vanished without a single gunshot, without a trace leaving behind only a note in trembling handwriting. Movement. In the web. They were trained men, armed alert veterans of the border raids, yet something in that temple complex moved faster than their lights, heavier than the rain. The jungle that night didn't breathe, it waited. March 1970. Just after dusk, the humidity pressed against the skin like steam from the earth. The patrol, 5 men from a MACV-SOG reconnaissance team, crossed into the ruins seeking a dry place to rest. The sound of dripping water, the hum of insects, the distant crackle of a failing radio, all ordinary, until the air grew still. The sergeant looked up. Between the trees hung strands, thick, pale, trembling in the flashlight's beam. Not vines, not rope. Threads webbing stretched across the ancient stone like silver scars. The first man stepped forward, brushed it aside, and froze. The line vibrated not down, but sideways like something pulling from the dark. A second later, the light went out. The jungle answered with silence. Hours later, their signal disappeared from the grid. No firefight. No distress call. Just static, and then a faint voice whispering through the comms. "They're above us." That was the last anyone heard from the patrol near Angkor Wat. The report was sealed, stamped environmental loss buried under miles of bureaucracy. But fragments leaked notes, letters, fragments of conversation between soldiers who swore they saw webs that shimmered under moonlight and moved when no wind blew. Welcome to the forgotten corridor of war, where legend and combat intersect, and the jungle keeps its own dead. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from, and the exact minute your pulse changes. Because what you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's a record erased, a story buried beneath temple stone and tropical vines. The soldiers called them the web dwellers. No one ever found what made the webs or what fed on the men who touched them. And somewhere out there among the ruins, something might still be weaving. March 1970. The borderlands between Cambodia and South Vietnam were a place of blurred lines and vanishing maps. The official records called it a neutral zone, but to the men on the ground, it was a maze of shadow operations, insertions that didn't exist, missions that couldn't be acknowledged. The war had spilled past the lines drawn on paper, and so had the men who followed it. MACV-SOG recon teams working under black radio silence moved through jungles where every echo could be an ambush or something worse. The terrain near Angkor Wat was unlike any other stone corridors swallowed by root steps carved into mountains of vine faces of forgotten gods watching through mist. The temple wasn't just ruins, it was a breathing labyrinth. The air smelled of rot and rain. Cicadas screamed and then stopped that sudden quiet soldiers learned to fear more than gunfire. You could hear your own pulse, your own boots dragging in mud. Sergeant Raymond Cole wrote later that it felt as if the jungle were listening back. He was the team leader that night, 30 years old, 2 tours deep, and too experienced to believe in anything supernatural. But when his unit reached the edge of the Angkor perimeter, the air changed thicker, almost electric, as if static clung to the vines. Their objective was simple: sweep. The site confirm a suspected cache point extract before dawn. The ruins were silent, no movement. No trace of enemy campfires, only the faint trickle of water through stone mouths carved centuries ago. The men joked at first, called it movie set creepy, said the place looked staged for ghosts. Cole's Corporal Eddie Moran carried the only functioning camera, a small Kodak Super 8. When they reviewed the footage weeks later, the first 30 seconds showed nothing but dust and stone. But the last frame, the very last one, was covered in a white blur, a single strand stretching across the lens. At 2200 hours, they established temporary rest. Cole's report mentioned a suspended web-like structure spanning 30 feet, unlike known insect patterns. He'd seen jungle webs before tarantulas, orb weavers, the usual, but this one had weight. He described how it bowed under its own tension, glistening faintly in the dark. They marked it for collection, but never cut a sample. 30 minutes later, the first noise came, a faint brushing sound, like branches shifting though there was no wind. Cole signaled a perimeter check. Private First Class Daniel Ruiz stepped out with a flashlight, and disappeared behind the eastern gallery. Seconds later, the beam flickered twice up, down, gone. Cole called his name, no response. Then the radio cracked once Ruiz's voice, low, distorted, whispering one word: movement. Static swallowed the rest. The patrol advanced cautiously. No trace of struggle, no prints, just the flashlight on the ground still warm. Cole wrote, area shows no sign of extraction or drag. Web strand at waist height broken. Tension release audible. They kept searching until the rain started a sudden violent curtain that turned the soil to red water. And through that rain, they heard something tapping against the temple wall, slow, deliberate, like wet rope hitting stone. At 23:10 hours, Cole ordered fallback to the western corridor. The remaining men reported flashes of reflection above them, thin threads crisscrossing the canopy, catching the starlight. The sound that followed wasn't thunder. It was vibration, low and constant, as if the jungle itself had begun to hum. One soldier fired a warning burst into the treetops. Nothing fell. The echo didn't return. The jungle ate it whole. Local villagers later said that the area was cursed, that no one should walk beneath the bridges of silk. They told interpreters that the temples were home to Pang-Ka, guardian spirits, who spun threads between worlds, trapping those who disturbed sacred ground. But in 1970, those stories never reached the field. To the soldiers, it was just another mission gone wrong until the second disappearance. At 00:30, when the rain eased, they found Corporal Moran's pack near the altar chamber. Inside a torn ration bag, the Super 8 camera, and what looked like hair but wasn't. It was filament, translucent, thick as cord, coiled tightly, like something had wrapped around his equipment and melted. Cole cut a piece off with his knife. The strand shrank at contact with metal, curling like something alive recoiling from heat. That was when they realized the web wasn't dry, it was damp, almost breathing. They left the ruins before dawn. 2 men missing. 3 remaining. Cole, Harding, and Bowers made camp 2 clicks south. At 0500, Cole's log ends mid-sentence, sound of dragging near perimeter. Object unseen. Team holding. The next entry wasn't written by him. It was transcribed later by a rescue unit sent days after. The camp was empty, fire still burning. On the tent pole, strands fused with ash. When the recovery team moved in, their sensors malfunctioned. Compass readings spun. The jungle had grown over the tracks in less than 72 hours. Locals said the vines moved faster there, as if the forest itself wanted to erase what happened. The official report would later claim monsoon erosion. But the photographs now buried in archives tell a different story. A perfect pattern of webbing stretched across stone hardened like glass, impossible to remove. The strange part, and the part that never made it past censorship, was what happened when the strand was exposed to sunlight. It smoked. It evaporated in seconds, leaving a scent like burned honey and iron. Scientists at the base tested the residue, organic but unidentified. By the time the last analysis was filed, the war had shifted. Cambodia plunged into chaos, and the site was left behind. Angkor Wat became again what it had always been, a monument to the forgotten. But those who heard Cole's tapes, fragments of his radio transmissions before contact, was lost, never forgot the last line. It's above the trees now. It's moving without sound. 50 years later, the U.S. records still listed as an environmental disappearance. The file name Operation Night Thread. No further details. No follow-up mission. Yet villagers continued to leave offerings at the temple edge, small fires and folded silk prayers whispered toward the canopy. They say when the air grows still and the moonlight fades through the ruins, you can hear the low hum again, like threads tightening across stone waiting. And maybe that's all the context we'll ever get, a place swallowed by vines, a mission erased by war, and the echo of something weaving through both history and nightmare. The first file to mention the disappearance appeared in a quarterly logistics report, buried between damaged equipment forms and fuel ration tallies. It read in dry military shorthand, Patrol Lima 7 missing in AO Angkor sector. Probable terrain collapse. Nothing else. No coordinates. No casualty list. But weeks later, in a courier pouch sent from Saigon to a classified archive in Long Bin, there were 2 additional documents, a debrief form marked restricted, and a medical evaluation for Sergeant Raymond Cole. Both were signed and redacted. Both contradict each other completely. The debrief claimed the men were separated by flooding and dense vegetation, an accident of nature unavoidable. But Cole's evaluation, written 2 days later by a base psychologist, contains a different story. The notes describe intense paranoia centered on perception of movement within environmental structures, vines, roots, webs, claims of luminous filament activity. The doctor wrote that the patient's skin bore no cuts, yet his uniform was shredded in linear patterns as though by abrasion from multiple filaments. When asked what happened to his men, Cole simply said, "They went up." The U.S. command filed it away under combat fatigue syndrome. But 2 weeks later, the same doctor filed for transfer. His reason: repeated auditory disturbances at night, resembling thread tension sounds. He was stationed nowhere near Angkor. Through the summer of 1970, reports from nearby operations began to surface. None official, all whispered. A gunner from a medevac crew swore he saw webs stretching between treetops, not the spider kind, but huge geometric shapes that seemed to pulse faintly when the helicopter's searchlight passed over them. Infantrymen from an adjacent platoon reported finding weapons hanging from the canopy, as though someone had tied them, their rifles, helmets, belts dangling 20 feet above the ground. When recovery teams tried to climb for them, the line snapped away, retracting into darkness. Still, the Army kept writing terrain failure. It was a phrase meant to bury questions. Later that year, the Smithsonian dispatched a team of biologists under civilian cover, citing interest in insect diversity in conflict zones. One of them, Dr. Leonard Avery, wrote in his private journal, recovered decades later, that he had seen webbing unlike any known species. It glistened even under overcast light, he wrote. No visible insects nearby. A vibration constant, independent of wind. Colleagues refused to enter the chamber where the material originated. I collected a sample. The strand resisted flame and chemical solvents. The next page ends mid-sentence, smudged by what looks like rain or sweat. Audible resonance increasing. Feels alive. Avery's notebooks vanished after his team's extraction flight. The U.S. Embassy filed a statement. Equipment lost during evacuation under hostile fire. But the helicopter logs show no such engagement that day. Years later, when files from Operation Rock Wall were partially declassified, investigators noticed a peculiar repetition. In the supply manifests for that quarter, silk gauze shipments to nearby bases had doubled, yet there were no medical reports of casualties requiring it. The material was being requisitioned for another purpose. Someone somewhere was trying to replicate what they found. Villagers in the Siem Reap outskirts remembered the foreigners. They remembered them carrying nets, flasks, and torches that burned blue. One old man interviewed by journalists in the 1990s described a night when the foreigners camped near the ruins. They said they were catching ghosts. He laughed softly, but the ghosts caught them instead. The temple site was abandoned again in 1971 when artillery began to roll through the region. By then, Cole had been discharged on medical grounds. His testimony faded into rumor until a shortwave recording surfaced from an amateur operator in Saigon. The tape, scratchy, barely audible, contained fragments of U.S. field chatter. A male voice repeats, "They're not threads, they're bridges. They're coming down. No date. No call sign." But the frequency belonged to Cole's original unit. Fact-checkers tried to dismiss it as fabrication. But one detail in the transcript matched exactly what was written in the Lost Patrol's last log, web-like formation, spanning 30 feet. It was the same measurement down to the inch. As the war dragged on, the story mutated. Reporters heard it from bartenders in Phnom Penh, pilots at the airstrip, local guides. Each version changed a little. Sometimes the men vanished into light, sometimes into sound, sometimes into the silk itself. The one constant was the sensation described by all who visited the site, the feeling of being watched from above, of strands crossing just beyond sight. In 1974, a small detachment of South Vietnamese scouts entered the Angkor sector to map routes for refugee movement. Only one of them, a young interpreter named Din, returned. He told officials that the trees had mouths. His phrasing was dismissed as trauma-induced metaphor. But his field notebook, later found by archaeologists, contains a sketch not of trees, but of threads arcing between trunks, each ending in a bulb-like knot drawn with shaky lines. Next to it he wrote, "The wind does not move them. They move themselves." Decades later, satellite imagery of the same area revealed patterns on the forest canopy, faint circular clearings symmetrical as mandalas. Botanists called them crown shyness gaps, natural separations between treetops. But the formations near Angkor didn't match the natural kind. The gaps were web-shaped, repeating the geometry of silk structures. No one officially connected it to the 1970 incident, but in the archived flight data of a reconnaissance drone from the 2000s, one note appears beside the coordinates camera. Glitch, thin reflective network detected. Every piece of evidence from Cole's torn uniform to Avery's vanished notebooks fits inside a pattern that never resolves. Something was there, something that left traces, but no body. The official stance remains silence. Yet every few years, a new visitor posts a photograph, threads draped over stone strands, thicker than any spider could weave, glinting in the dark. The army called it terrain failure. The locals called it curse. But the documents, the unredacted few that survive, use a term repeated 3 times: unidentified filamentary organism. The phrasing is clinical, but the implication is clear. They believed something alive had made those webs, and that's what remains at the center of the file, not proof, not myth, but a residue of fact, too strange to classify. The web existed. The men did not return. The jungle reclaimed the evidence, yet the reports never stopped. Every decade, someone goes missing near those coordinates drawn by the story, the mystery, the promise of something that moves where the light ends. The record ends, as always, with silence and a single line typed in uppercase letters at the bottom of the page: further investigation not recommended. For months after Cole's discharge, the story refused to die. It spread along the transport routes like a fever, whispered in mess halls, retold in letters that never reached home. Soldiers called it the Angkor Web, a name that sounded half like a code word, half like a curse. The older ones dismissed it as combat hallucination. The younger ones carried it like a warning. Don't bivouac near the ruins. Don't shine your light upward. Don't cut anything that looks like silk. And above all, if the jungle goes quiet, move. There was another team, Bravo Recon, attached to the same command line. They went in 3 months later under a different objective: locate any surviving equipment from Cole's unit and confirm terrain stability. Their Lieutenant Alan Merrick was pragmatic, skeptical, a man who believed fear was a disease cured only by procedure. He read the debriefs, scoffed, and wrote in his pre-mission notes, "Superstitious nonsense. Webs don't swallow men." They inserted at dawn under light fog. The trees near Angkor looked harmless in daylight, thin vines, sandstone walls veined with roots. The air smelled of dust and resin. They carried flamethrowers and demolition charges, prepared to burn out any traps. At 0930, Merrick's team reached the outer wall. The radio log captured everything until 10:17. What happened in those 47 minutes would be pieced together later from the surviving tape. Merrick's voice calm, deliberate, describing entry into the main corridor. Then a pause, a different tone. Threads across the archway. Not natural. Almost metallic. Another soldier, laughing nervously, says, "Probably cocoon stuff, sir." The sound that follows isn't laughter. It's the shriek of the flamethrower igniting. Then static. When the transmission stabilizes, Merrick is breathing hard. "It didn't burn," he says. "It turned black and fell upward. Upward." The playback technicians rewound that segment a dozen times. Each time the word was the same: upward. The strand, they said, rose into the ceiling like smoke reversed. By noon, half the team was gone. The radio carried fragments, boots, scraping stone, shouts echoing from multiple directions, though the chamber geometry didn't allow it. Merrick's last coherent order was, "Stay in pairs. Keep your lights low." After that, only one gunshot. The rescue operation came 2 days later. They found no bodies, but 3 M16s were fused into a lattice above the entrance, locked together by hardened silk that had turned gray and glassy. The pattern wasn't random. It formed a spiral. Within weeks, command sealed the area entirely. They dropped sensors to monitor seismic activity and forbade further entry. Yet every night, the detectors recorded the same rhythmic vibration, a pulse rising through the ground, repeating every 13 seconds. The engineers wrote it off as microtremors. Others thought it sounded like breathing. Then came the civilian report. A team of archaeologists mapping temple corridors stumbled upon something impossible. Columns wrapped in filaments thick as vines, each filament covered in a thin layer of moisture that reflected light like mirror shards. The lead researcher, Professor Than Sarath, wrote, "The material is both organic and mineral, excreting a resin that hardens upon contact with air." His next line, "I believe it is still being produced." Sarath's assistant, a French intern named Lemoine, snapped photographs. They show more than stone and silk. They show movement blur, long streaks of shadow, bending between columns, as if something crawled across the frame mid-shot. He sent those negatives to Paris for development. They never arrived. By late 1971, the war had devoured the borders. Airstrikes fell near Siem Reap, and the ruins became a front line no one controlled. But through the chaos, radio intercepts kept picking up the same word in different languages, the Weavers. South Vietnamese scouts said it. Villagers said it. Even the Khmer Rouge units who later occupied the area spoke of silk bridges and night harvesters. None could say what they saw, only that they stopped sending men near the site after dark. When Cole was interviewed a final time before his disappearance in 1973, he looked hollow, his eyes moving as if following something invisible. The interviewer asked if he remembered the sound. He nodded once and whispered, like thread pulling through flesh. He vanished a week later from his home in North Carolina. No forced entry, no struggle. Only a shattered window screen, a square of mesh torn cleanly from its frame. By the late 1970s, the story was folklore. Veterans met at bars and compared versions, each more unbelievable than the last. Some said the webs were chemical experiments sprayed to map humidity or track movement. Others believed they were natural silk from some prehistoric species awakened by the bombing. But among those who'd served near Angkor, a darker theory circulated that the web dwellers weren't creatures at all, but something sentient, a system, a living network that fed on movement, memory, or maybe fear. One pilot described flying over the ruins at dusk. Below him, the jungle canopy rippled not with wind, but with pattern. It looked like the earth breathing, he said. The air above the temple shimmered as if heat rose from the stone, though his instruments showed no temperature spike. The co-pilot snapped a Polaroid. The photo shows faint concentric circles, as if something enormous and invisible had spread itself across the treetops. Years later, a journalist recovered fragments of a film reel labeled Angkor Recon 2 from an abandoned base locker. The footage is shaky handheld filmed at night. It begins with soldiers walking along corridors, flashlight beams slicing through fog. Then, without warning, the light flares against a white surface so close it fills the frame. For a moment, you can see texture, not stone, not fabric, but skin patterned like lace. The camera drops. The last frame shows an open space where the ceiling should be glistening, like water trembling as if breathing. Then black. The journalist who tried to publish it received a cease order citing national security. When he replayed the tape months later, the section with the white surface was gone, replaced by static. By the 1980s, the site had reclaimed itself. Trees grew through collapsed walls. Tourists returned unaware of the missing patrols or the sealed vaults beneath their feet. But local guides still refused to enter certain courtyards after sunset. They told visitors the same warning. At night, the air thickens. Don't look up. Modern researchers revisiting Cole's report found that his sketches matched exact portions of the temple layout, unseen in daylight chambers, overgrown, inaccessible then and now. No satellite scan penetrated them. One geophysicist noted anomalies, hollow spaces, where no passage should exist, as if tunnels had been carved recently, not centuries ago. When the team placed motion sensors, the data returned an eerie signature: synchronized vibrations, rhythmic and slow, consistent with biological respiration. They thought the machines malfunctioned until the same pattern repeated at different coordinates, miles apart. Whatever was moving beneath Angkor wasn't a single entity. It was a network. That was the moment the story turned from myth to possibility. In a 1999 interview, a retired field analyst named Harding, the last survivor of Cole's team, finally spoke. He'd lived in silence for 30 years, refusing journalists burning letters. When he finally agreed to talk, his voice trembled, but his words were precise. It wasn't a spider, he said. It was the web itself. He described how the threads thickened the deeper they went, forming corridors within corridors. The silk wasn't built on the ruins. The ruins had grown inside it, as if the web had come first, and the stone had conformed around it. He said the light changed inside those tunnels blue-white like the reflection of moonlight on ice, yet no source could be found. The air tasted metallic. His final sentence before he broke down was simple. It learns the shape of whatever it touches. They ended the interview there. Harding died a month later in his sleep, or at least that's what the record says. His nurse reported waking to find strands of translucent fiber across the bedroom window stretching from wall to wall. The cleaning staff removed them before investigators arrived. The official conclusion remained unchanged: psychological deterioration, hallucination. But his tape still exists. You can hear the click of the recorder turning on, his breathing steady, his final words clear, before the tape runs out. If it ever moves again, we won't see it coming. And somewhere between the silence of war and the stillness of the ruins, the sound continues, a faint vibration, a hum that rises through the stone like a heartbeat caught between worlds. Whether it's wind or something else, no one can say. But the pattern repeats every 13 seconds, the same rhythm recorded in 1970. The jungle remembers, and the web still breathes. When the first scientists returned in the 1990s, they came not as soldiers, but as preservationists. UNESCO had begun documenting the damage from years of war, collapsed corridors, bullet scars, roots devouring statues. The official line was archaeology, but among the researchers were several analysts from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, traveling under civilian credentials. Their interest wasn't heritage, it was material science. Reports from the old archives had mentioned a filament that resisted fire, acid, and ultraviolet degradation. If it existed, it could have military value. They began near the western cloister, where sunlight struggled to touch the moss. The lead investigator, Dr. Hannah Sloan, described finding strands embedded in the stone running parallel like veins under skin. The fibers couldn't be carbon. They predated any known synthetic polymer. They were warm. She wrote, "Touching it feels like the pulse under your wrist." Her assistant tried to scrape a sample with a scalpel. The blade snapped. When they applied heat, the strand contracted, curling away from the flame like muscle. They logged everything on film, their voices calm, but rising with every discovery. Then one night, the cameras recorded movement in the background, not the slow sway of vines, but sudden coordinated shifts in the shadows above them. The audio picks up a faint tremor like a sigh drawn through hundreds of throats. Seconds later, dust falls from the ceiling. The tape ends with Dr. Sloan whispering, "It's awake." That footage never aired. Officials declared it corrupted by humidity. But a technician who digitized the reels decades later insisted there were shapes in the final frames, not spiders, not insects, but filaments converging into a human silhouette, tall and thin, dissolving as the frame brightened. Locals had their own explanation. They said the web dwellers were not creatures, but echoes, the trapped spirits of those who built the temples, weaving themselves into the stone to guard it from outsiders. The silk was their memory made visible. Whenever men disturbed the ruins, the memories tightened around them, pulling them back into the fabric. They called it the hunger of the temple. And yet, there were physical traces no superstition could account for. In 2004, a French photographer working on an art project captured wide-angle shots of Angkor's reflection pools at night. The long exposures revealed faint, luminous arcs crossing the sky, threads of light that curved where nothing was supposed to move. The digital files carried metadata errors. Exposure times duplicated themselves, timestamps looping back several seconds as if the camera had been trapped in its own cycle. When the photographer returned to the same spot weeks later, the equipment failed entirely. The memory cards were blank, overwritten by static. He said the silence there was unnatural, total. Even the frogs refused to croak. He described the sensation of being inside something enormous, something listening. He left Cambodia the next morning and never went back. By 2010, drones began mapping the terrain. Thermal scans showed narrow bands of residual heat crossing the ruins at night, moving independently of temperature shifts. Each line measured 10 meters wide, glowing faintly and vanishing before dawn. Engineers suggested soil moisture differentials, but the data repeated with mathematical precision every 13 seconds, a pulse moving north to south. The same rhythm recorded in 1970. There is an image from that survey that remains classified. Those who've seen it say it shows Angkor Wat from above the temple, framed in moonlight, but beneath the treetops faint rings of phosphorescence forming a web the size of a city. It's too perfect to be natural, too symmetrical to be chaos. Meanwhile, folklore flourished online. Veterans' families posted letters and stories. Someone leaked a transcript from an internal email thread between two analysts. One line stands out: biological structure exhibits neural response when exposed to electromagnetic frequencies, pattern identical to human REM cycles. It suggested the unthinkable: the web wasn't just alive, it was dreaming. If that were true, the ruins weren't decaying, they were sleeping, and every disturbance risked waking them. Villagers reported tremors again in 2013. Tour guides spoke of tourists collapsing after walking through certain chambers, complaining of vertigo and hearing whispers. One said he saw a shimmer ripple across the air, like heat mirage but cooler. He turned and found his group gone. They reappeared minutes later, confused, claiming they'd been walking in circles around the same courtyard, though the path was straight. When they watched the footage later, their shadows moved before they did. Across the world, museums displayed fragments from Angkor carvings, statues, artifacts, all under strict preservation. But one statue in a Paris collection began secreting a clear resin from its base, staining the marble. Laboratory tests failed to identify the substance, though under microscope, it revealed perfect filament lattices, identical to spider silk, but of unknown origin. The curator sealed it in glass and filed the report quietly. In the years since, scientists have speculated about environmental illusions, hallucinogenic spores, even ancient nanofibers left by forgotten artisans. But every theory avoids the same core: the web reacts. It changes with contact, learns shape, remembers light, and each time someone tries to analyze it, the evidence degrades faster, as if resisting understanding. What remains are echoes, hums, vibrations, light, distortions, recorded again and again by devices that shouldn't malfunction yet always do. Perhaps the most haunting detail is from a military satellite feed dated 2018. During a routine orbital pass, an operator noticed an anomaly. Angkor's outline blurred for a single frame, replaced by a circular shadow spreading outward. Within seconds, it corrected, but the data log shows the satellite's signal strength dipped precisely every 13 seconds for the rest of the night. When asked later, the analyst who noticed it said quietly, "It felt like something blinked." The bridge between fact and folklore is narrowing. A web made of biology and myth. A temple built over something that never stopped moving. Soldiers, scientists, villagers, all left with the same sensation: being watched from above. If you stand in those ruins now after midnight, you'll feel it too, a tremor in the air, too slow to be wind, too measured to be random. Touch the stone and it's warm. Look up and maybe, just maybe, you'll see a line glimmering in the moonlight, vanishing the moment you breathe. It's easy to call it illusion. Easier still to call it legend. But legends don't pulse with the heartbeat of machinery, and illusions don't hum with the rhythm of memory. Whatever the web dwellers were, animal, ghost, or dream, they left behind a signature that refuses to die. Something still stirs between those ancient walls, a design older than the war that woke it. And if it is dreaming, then one day it might decide to open its eyes. They say the jungle never forgets. The war ended, the guns fell silent, and the ruins were reclaimed by moss and roots. Yet some places still breathe differently when the night comes. Angkor Wat stands proud again, a monument visited by thousands, cameras, flashing laughter echoing through the same corridors where men once vanished without sound. But when the crowds fade, when the last guide's voice disappears beyond the trees, the silence returns, and the air tightens as if remembering. Every generation finds its own version of the story. Tourists speak of cameras that shut down at the same spots of lights flickering as if drained by something unseen. Drone pilots report glitches, the same frequency, the same 13-second rhythm, long after all theories should have died. Some say it's electromagnetic interference. Others whisper that the pattern is breathing. What remains are fragments, a melted camera reel, a soldier's torn journal, vibrations deep in the soil. Evidence that refuses to disappear but never reveals its truth. Maybe the web dwellers were nothing more than fear given shape, a story born from darkness and humidity. Maybe they were real, a living network that learned to mimic silence that still moves when no one's watching. Between myth and memory lies the space where the human mind invents gods or encounters them. Every year on the anniversary of Operation Night Thread, locals light incense near the Western Gate. They say it's for the soldiers who never came home, but others claim it's for something else, an offering to keep the threads still, to keep the old spirits sleeping. When wind slides through the corridors, the sound is not a whisper, not quite a moan, but the low, resonant hum of strings pulled tight. And in that vibration, some swear they can hear words, not in Khmer, not in English. Just a pattern that almost sounds like language rising, falling, repeating every 13 seconds. Maybe it's imagination. Maybe it's the jungle remembering what it's owed. But the pattern never breaks, and the ruins never rest. Whatever was woven into those stones has learned patience. Time means nothing to something that can wait in the dark. The night at Angkor belongs to them, the unseen architects, the silent listeners, the keepers of threads that bind history and fear together. They are not hunting anymore. They are listening. And if you ever find yourself standing beneath those towers, when the air turns heavy and the world seems to hold its breath, don't look up. You've just heard another file from Echoes of the Unknown. If you want to follow the next thread, subscribe and keep your light close.